2016, I was granted a licence by the UK Secretary of State for Defence to lead a group of seasoned technical divers, each a specialist in a particular field, to survey the wreck of the 10,850-tonne armoured cruiser HMS Hampshire on the 100th anniversary of its loss after striking a German mine off northwest Orkney in a severe gale on the night of 6 June 1916. Hampshire was carrying the British Secretary of State for War, Lord Horatio Herbert Kitchener, on a secret diplomatic mission to Archangel on the White Sea of northern Russia, along with the British Minister of Munitions and his staff. Of the 749 souls aboard, only 12 would survive the sinking, and the loss of Britain's most famous soldier would send shockwaves across the nation, triggering a rash of conspiracy theories such as you would see today. Was it really a mine, as per the official explanation, or was it a bomb planted by German, Irish, or even British saboteurs? Great play was made of the fact that the Stromness lifeboat had not put to sea to pick up survivors, and that locals trying to get to the scene to help on a shore search were turned back at bayonet point. But for all the conspiracy theories that raged for decades, today we now know the simple truth. Hampshire was sunk by a mine laid 1 week earlier by the German submarine U-75 as part of German preparations for what developed into the Battle of Jutland. The wreck of HMS Hampshire today lies in the Atlantic in about 70 metres of water, some 1.5 miles off the towering 200-foot-high cliffs of Marwick Head at the northwest tip of the main island of Orkney. It is a very special and sensitive wreck for the people of Orkney, its memory deeply entwined in the fabric of Orkney itself. At just over 473 feet long, with a beam of 68.5 feet, the large armoured cruiser Hampshire was a strong, powerful warship well suited to the proposed voyage of 1,649 nautical miles through challenging seas up the west coast of Norway around the North Cape before entering the White Sea to dock at Archangel. Hampshire was one of 6 Devonshire-class armoured cruisers that were constructed in an attempt to improve on the preceding Monmouth class of armoured cruiser, which had been built between 1901 and 1903. As the Monmouth class cruisers had only been expected to fight light cruisers and iron merchant ships, they had been fitted with a main battery of 14 6-inch guns. For the new Devonshire class, to avoid an excessive increase in size, a main battery of 4 more powerful 7.5-inch Vickers Mark I guns would be installed, whilst a number of the twin 6-inch turrets and the forward double 2-storey casemates of the Monmouth class would be removed. The vertical waterline armour belt would be strengthened from the 4-inch waterline belt of the Monmouth class to a 6-inch thick belt in the Devonshire class, and the waterline belt would be reduced in height by 1 foot to save weight. The hull of the Hampshire was laid down on 1 September 1902 by Armstrong Whitworth at their Elswick shipyard near Newcastle. Almost exactly 1 year later, on 24 September 1903, the new armoured cruiser was named and launched for fitting out a float and the addition of the waterline armour belt plates. The new ship, named after the English county of Hampshire, was completed on 15th June 1905 and would carry a ship's complement of 655 officers and men. Hampshire was powered by 2 4-cylinder triple expansion steam engines, each engine driving 1 propeller shaft and together producing 21,000 indicated horsepower that gave Hampshire a maximum speed of 22.4 knots. Her 2 manganese bronze propellers, each weighing approximately 43 tonnes, had a diameter of almost 16 feet, with each blade being about the size of a man, as you can see from this photo of her port propeller, illegally salved in 1983 and now lying at the Scapa Flow Museum on the island of Hoy. 17 3-drum Yarrow boilers and 6 cylindrical Scotch marine boilers provided the high-pressure steam for the 2 engines. She carried just over 1,000 tonnes of coal in her bunkers to fire the boilers, giving her an operational range of about 3,500 nautical miles. Hampshire's main battery of 4 breech-loading 7.5-inch guns were mounted in 4 single gun turrets in a diamond arrangement. A turret was set on the centre line of the forecastle forward of the bridge. 2 more turrets were set in the P and Q wing positions, one either side of the bridge superstructure. The 4th, being Y turret, was set on the centre line towards the stern. These 45 calibre 7.5-inch Vickers Mark I guns were in service with the Royal Navy between 1905 and 1920 and were only ever mounted on Devonshire-class cruisers, they could fire a 200-pound shell out to a range of about 8 miles. The secondary battery at the time of construction comprised 6 breech-loading 6-inch Mark 7 guns, arranged one on either beam amidships in a single casemate, along with a vertical double casemate on either beam towards the stern. A gun crew of 9 was required to operate each 6-inch gun, and it could fire a 100-pound common lyddite high-explosive shell out to maximum range of just under 7 miles. The low amidships gun and the lower gun in the 2-storey casemates aft were found to be of limited use, particularly in a poor sea, and after the Battle of Jutland in 1916 they were demounted, given gun shields and set on the upper platform deck, replacing 4 of the smaller 3-pounders which were then landed. The low and now vacant casemate openings were then plated over to improve seakeeping. Hampshire was also fitted at the time of her construction with 2 single 12-pounder landing guns that could be dismounted for service ashore. As built, 18 quick-firing 3-pounder guns were set 9 along the midsection of either beam between foremast and mainmast in the black notches you can see in this archive peacetime photograph. You can tell it's a peacetime photo as the funnels still have identification white banding painted around them. On the outbreak of war, the funnels were painted uniform grey to confuse enemy identification attempts. These reliable quick-firing guns were in use with the Royal Navy from 1886 right up until the 1950s and were able to fire a 3.3-pound common lyddite or armour-piercing shell every couple of seconds out to over 2 miles, with a rapid rate of fire of 30 rounds per minute. They were intended as a defence against fast enemy torpedo boats that might attack the vulnerable beam of the ship. 2 lateral 18-inch torpedo tubes were fitted, one on either side of the ship, just forward of the bridge superstructure. Torpedo hatch doors and the outer hull plating opened to allow a protective ram that held the torpedo itself to project laterally from the vessel's beam, so that the torpedo was wholly outside the ship before it was fired. If it was fired out to the side from a torpedo tube inside the hull, the torpedo might jam due to water pressure as the vessel moved ahead. The ship's citadel comprised a 6-inch thick vertical waterline armour belt on either beam that ran from in front of A turret to abaft Y turret. The after end of the citadel was closed off by a 5-inch thick transverse bulkhead situated just abaft the aftmost 7.5-inch Y turret. To secure the armour belt plates to the hull, from inside the hull large bolts went through the thin steel of the shell plating of the hull itself before going through 2 inches of teak to tap directly into the inside face of each 6-inch armour plate. Teak was used around the waterline as it would absorb the impact of incoming shells striking the waterline belt, distributing the impact and helping the armour plate to avoid shattering or bending excessively on impact and thus allowing water to enter the hull. Out with the citadel, the waterline armour belt tapered to 2 inches thick. The horizontal deck armour ranged from 3/4 of an inch to 2 inches, whilst the conning tower was protected by 12 inches. Deep inside the ship, directly below the command bridge and the superstructure, was an auxiliary control room that was fitted with a helm, engine order telegraphs, revolutions telegraph, and a navigation compass binnacle that was set directly behind a non-magnetic brass bulkhead which ran across the ship and would not interfere with the magnetic compass itself. Following completion in July 1905, Hampshire was assigned to the 1st Cruiser Squadron of the Channel Fleet, together with most of her sister Devonshire-class armoured cruisers. 6 to 7 years later, in December 1911, she was assigned to the 6th Cruiser Squadron of the Mediterranean Fleet before being transferred the following year to the Royal Navy's China Station. When Britain entered World War I on 4th August 1914, she was based in the northeast of China. Operating with the larger armoured cruiser Minotaur, which was the flagship of the China Station, along with the light cruiser Newcastle, Hampshire was tasked to destroy the German radio station on the western Pacific island of Yap, situated far out in the Pacific in the Carley Islands. En route, just 1 week after the declaration of war, the British Naval Squadron sunk the collier SS Elspeth on 11th August 1914. Able only to carry just over 1,000 tons of coal, Hampshire was by now running low, and so she was detached and sent back to Hong Kong, taking the crew of the Elspeth with her. Hampshire was then sent south to the neutral Dutch East Indies to search for German merchant shipping, before being sent to search for the German light cruiser Emden which Vice Admiral Maximilian Graf von Spee, in charge of the East Asia Squadron, was deploying to the Indian Ocean to harass Allied shipping. Ingeniously, the Emden's captain had added a false fourth funnel en route to the Indian Ocean as he passed through the neutral Dutch East Indies to make Emden look like a British light cruiser. Emden sighted the more powerful Hampshire off Sumatra, but managed to elude her and go on to sink a succession of Allied vessels before she was eventually tracked and sunk by the Australian light cruiser Sydney on 9th November 1914 near the British Cocos Islands. Once Emden was destroyed, Hampshire was released to head for Britain for service with the Grand Fleet. En route, she escorted an Anzac troop convoy through the Indian Ocean and up the Red Sea to Egypt. Hampshire was refitted en route at Gibraltar in December 1914 before continuing on to Britain to join the fleet. On arrival back in Britain in January 1915, Hampshire was assigned to the 7th Cruiser Squadron, and in November 1915 she escorted shipping in the White Sea of northern Russia. Hampshire then returned to British waters, and serving with the 2nd Cruiser Squadron, she saw action at the Battle of Jutland on 31st May and 1st June 1916. Although the enemy did not engage her, Hampshire fired 4 salvos at German warships, which fell short of their targets. She also fired at suspected German submarine periscopes throughout the day. During the preceding year of 1915, Russia, an ally of Great Britain, had suffered a series of overwhelming defeats as German and Austro-Hungarian armies advanced on the Eastern Front. Britain had been supplying extensive stocks of munitions and ordnance to the Imperial Russian Army, who were making demands for additional huge consignments. In May 1916, therefore, it was determined that a high-ranking British minister should go to Russia on a 3-week mission to examine the situation and discuss common war aims and military strategy. The British Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, the creator of Britain's new volunteer army and organiser of Western Front resistance, seemed ideally suited to be able to assess the strategic position. Britain had already expended vast sums of money in funding the Russian war effort, and faced with Russian demands for more ordnance, Kitchener would take the British Minister of Munitions with him. Together they would gauge just how far Britain's factories could assist. This was a powerful, high-ranking diplomatic mission to Russia to agree war aims, and was intended to impress on the Russians that Britain was not a bottomless source of munitions. The Hampshire would also allegedly carry a secret consignment of gold to help fund the Russian war effort. Lord Kitchener, the British Secretary of State for War, had been the driving force behind Britain's recruitment campaign in the early years of World War I. He was the face of the now iconic "Your Country Needs You" recruiting poster of 1914, in which wherever you are, the face of Kitchener seems to be looking at you and pointing at you. But by 1916 he was being openly criticised for his war tactics and beliefs. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Battle of Verdun had already been raging for more than 3 months, and the Somme offensive was in planning to begin the following month of July 1916. Kitchener left London for Scapa Flow by overnight train on the evening of 4th June 1916. Arriving at Thurso on the treacherous Pentland Firth of northern Scotland on the morning of 5th June, in stormy conditions he crossed the Pentland Firth to Scapa Flow in the destroyer HMS Oak. He had never been a good sailor and was unwell during the stormy crossing. Kitchener was received by Admiral Jellicoe, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, and his officers aboard the fleet flagship, the battleship Iron Duke. Over lunch, Kitchener listened with interest as Jellicoe and his officers recounted their exploits at the Battle of Jutland, which had taken place only a few days earlier. The commander of the Hampshire, Captain Saville, had received his sailing orders the day before, 4th June. Hampshire was to depart Scapa Flow on the late afternoon of Kitchener's arrival, 5th June, bound for Archangel in northern Russia. It would be a long voyage of 1,649 miles that would take Hampshire up the east coast of Orkney on a route that was regularly swept for mines. Hampshire would then keep more than 200 miles off the Norwegian coast and maintain a speed of not less than 18 knots up to latitude 62 degrees north, which is north of the Norwegian coastal city of Bergen. Hampshire would have an escort of the 2 destroyers Victor and Unity up to latitude 62 degrees north, and from there Hampshire would proceed alone at 16 knots, zigzagging to avoid torpedo attack. But as Kitchener arrived in the great natural harbour of Scapa Flow at noon, As you can see from this archive photograph of him crossing from the destroyer Oak to Iron Duke, the weather was already poor and worsening. It is already wet and windy. The officers are in their greatcoats, while sailors are in full oilskins. Kitchener's greatcoat billows in the gusting wind. By the time lunch with Jellicoe was finished, a gale was blowing from the northeast that was creating heavy seas along the east coast of the Orkneys, which made minesweeping difficult. The Admiralty felt that the atrocious sea conditions would make it difficult for the Hampshire's two smaller destroyer escorts to keep up with the much bigger armoured cruiser. Worse, German submarine activity on the east coast had also been reported, and so, after looking at the options, the fateful decision was made to reroute Hampshire and send her up the west coast of Orkney, where it was thought that the islands of Orkney would offer some protection whilst the northeast gale blew itself out. Of the two available approved routes up the west coast of the Orkneys, it was decided to use the route that had been set up 6 months earlier, in January 1916, which went close inshore up the west coast of the western Orkney island of Hoy. This route was not regularly swept for mines, as it was thought that no German mine layer would dare operate this close inshore to the heavily protected main base of the British Grand Fleet. It was thought that this inshore route would give the two smaller escort destroyers some shelter from the northeasterly gale and enable them to keep up with the much larger cruiser Hampshire. A fateful decision having been made, and now fully fuelled and fully munitioned, Hampshire slipped her mooring buoy and headed south across Scapa Flow, clearing the harbour about 20 to 5. She steamed south through the southern entrance to the flow called Hoxa Sound, and then turned westwards into the Pentland Firth to rendezvous with her two escort destroyers Victor and Unity off Torness at the southwest of Hoy at 5:45. Sheltered in the lee of the islands, the two destroyers fell into line astern of Hampshire, and the flotilla moved off at the ordered speed of 18 knots. The prevailing weather conditions had, however, been misinterpreted, for within an hour of the decision to change the route being made, the storm centre had passed overhead, and the wind backed sharply to the northwest. The conditions now facing Hampshire and our escorts were exactly the opposite of what had been predicted. As the flotilla rounded the southwest corner of Hoy and started to move up the west coast, they were turning into the full force of what was now a severe gale. As they came out of the lee of the islands, the seas quickly built up, such that very quickly, within 20 minutes of setting off, the smaller and less powerful destroyer Victor had to signal at 6:05 that she could only maintain 15 knots. Then just 5 minutes later, at 6:10, Unity signalled that she could only maintain 12 knots. And then just 8 minutes later, at 18 minutes past 6, Unity signalled that she could now only make 10 knots. Such a slow speed would make the flotilla very vulnerable to any lurking German submarine. So within 2 minutes of the signal from Unity, Hampshire signalled at 6:20 that Unity should detach and return to base. Shortly after this, Victor signalled that she could not now maintain any speed greater than 12 knots. Again, within just a few minutes of this signal, at 6:30, Hampshire signalled that Victor should also return to base. The two destroyers were off the entrance to Hoy Sound when they turned for home. Hampshire now went on alone, fighting the fury of what had developed into a force 9 severe gale and had produced 7 to 10 metre high swells. Despite her great size, Hampshire herself was now struggling to make progress up the west coast, beating into the towering seas. As she went through the swell, her bow rose up towards the crest of each wave before dipping and crashing down, the bowsplash billowing over her foredeck and sweeping her bridge. Such were the conditions that she could only make 13.5 knots. After almost 2 hours of beating into this unrelenting 10-metre high swell, at about 20 to 9 in the evening, Hampshire was about 1.5 miles offshore between Marwick Head and the Broch of Bursey. It was still light. Folk ashore were able to see the great ship in the distance. Suddenly, a rumbling explosion forward shook the whole ship. She had hit a mine, which had blown a hole in her keel between the bow and the bridge. The helm jammed, and as power failed, the lights gradually went out below decks. With no power, she could not make radio contact with the shore to call for assistance, although the explosion and her distress had been seen by folk ashore. According to survivor accounts, the explosion seemed to have taken place on the port side just forward of the bridge, and seemed to tear the heart right out of the ship. Her bow immediately began to settle into the water, and a cloud of brown, suffocating smoke poured up from the stoker's mess forward, making it difficult to see on the bridge. In such stormy seas, most of the crew had been down below decks, with most hatches battened down and shored up for the night. The crew now began to knock out the wedges and proceed to their stations. The after hatch to the quarterdeck was open, and as the crew streamed aft away from the explosion forward and suffocating smoke, an officer was heard to call out, "Make way for Lord Kitchener." He passed by, clad in his greatcoat, and went up the after hatch, just in front of one of the 12 survivors. Hampshire was now settling quickly by the bow, and with complete onboard power failure, none of the larger boom boats and pinnaces could be hoisted out. Those smaller wooden lifeboats that were lowered into the water on davits were smashed to pieces against the side of the ship by the seas. Not one of the 12 survivors saw any boat get clear away from the ship. A number of men nevertheless boarded the large boom boats and lifeboats, which remained on their cradles and couldn't be lowered. They clung to the forlorn hope that as the ship went down, these boats would float off, but these boats and the unfortunate crews in them would be carried down with the Hampshire. As for Lord Kitchener, the Times of Friday, 9th June 1916 reported that Kitchener's party boarded a boat that was subsequently swamped by the sea. He was never seen again. As Hampshire settled by the bow, her stern began to lift slowly out of the water. Her propellers were seen by a survivor to be clear of the water and still revolving. Hampshire heeled slowly over to starboard, and an explosion was reported that caused smoke and flame to belch from just behind the bridge. It was likely that by this stage, with Hampshire being twice as long as the depth of water, that her bow was already grounding on the seabed. With her bow submerged and her stern high, Hampshire then capsized fully to starboard, and after lingering upside down for a moment, some 15 minutes after striking the mine, her stern disappeared beneath the waves. Only 3 oval cork and wood Carley floats got away from the sinking ship. These rigid Carley floats were made from a length of copper tubing divided into waterproof sections that was bent into an oval ring, then surrounded by cork or kapok and covered with a layer of waterproof canvas. The raft was rigid and could remain buoyant even if the waterproof outer skin of individual compartments was punctured. A large Carley float got away with 40 to 50 men on it, being driven southeast by the wind for 4 to 5 hours. The men in this open raft were drenched, badly affected by wind chill. Most of them were soon suffering from exposure, losing consciousness or foaming slightly at the mouth. Those that lost consciousness never regained it. When the raft was driven ashore some 4 hours later at 1:15 in the morning, just north of Scale Bay, only 4 of its occupants were left alive. A second Carley float got away with about 40 men in it, and another 30 were picked up from the water. Not all crew were wearing their life preservers, and it was reported that as the raft couldn't hold the number of men now attempting to crowd onto it, an officer ordered those men wearing life preservers to enter the water and swim for shore. None of those that did survived. Almost 4 hours later, at 1 o'clock in the morning, when the raft finally surged up onto the rocks in a small creek called Nebby Gio, half a mile north of Scale Bay, there were only 6 men alive. They now faced a treacherous climb up the cliffs to safety. A third Carley float got away with only 6 men in it. It too drifted southeast before the wind for 4 to 5 hours. Faced with the severe conditions, it had been capsized twice, jettisoning the men into the sea before it was finally driven ashore at Scale Bay, some 4 miles to the south, by when only 2 men were left alive. In all, 737 men had perished, including Lord Kitchener. There were only 12 survivors. The subsequent search at sea located 13 mines in the vicinity of the tragedy that had been laid at a depth of 3 to 9 metres, deep enough to let smaller, less valuable vessels such as fishing boats sail over the top of them. These mines were designed to catch only bigger prey. On 22nd June 1916, the Royal Navy minesweeper Laurel Crown hit another one of these mines whilst minesweeping. The explosion in such a small vessel, just a steam drifter, killed 9 of her crew. The log of the German submarines subsequently revealed that a spread of 34 mines had been laid on 29th May 1916 as part of German plans for an operation that would develop into the Battle of Jutland and would take place 5 to 6 days before Hampshire set off for Russia. U-75 sailed from Germany to mine the area 2 days before Admiral Jellicoe, Commander-in-Chief of the British Grand Fleet, even knew of Lord Kitchener's proposed journey. With the death of Lord Kitchener, Germany had unintentionally scored an immense victory. Kitchener may have been out of favour, but he was still a national hero. The great liberator of the Sudan, he had led the relief force that had lifted the Mahdi's siege of Khartoum in an attempt to save that other hero of the British Empire, General Gordon. He had quelled the Boer uprising in South Africa, and on his return home had been given a rapturous and patriotic welcome. It was thus natural that at the outbreak of World War I, Britain should have turned to its supreme warlord for leadership and appointed him Secretary of State for War. His loss was an untimely and bitter blow for the nation. The Kitchener Memorial, a 48-foot-high stone tower, was erected by public subscription on Marwick Head, the closest point to the scene of the disaster. It was unveiled in 1926 to remember Britain's Secretary of State for War, but he was just one of the 737 men who had died, and no other names appeared on the tower. So, when the Orkney Heritage Society were restoring the tower for the 100th anniversary commemorations in 2016, they also created an adjacent low arch-shaped wall, which was engraved with the names of all of those lost on the night of 5th June 1916, and also included the names of the 9 crew of the minesweeper Laurel Crown, which sank after hitting another of U-75's mines nearby on 22nd June 1916. The wall was unveiled on the 100th anniversary, 5th June 2016. The wreck of HMS Hampshire lies in just under 70 metres of water. That's about 220 feet, and is a wreck that is shrouded in mystery and intrigue. Conspiracy theories aren't just a modern thing, they've been around since the dawn of time, and the loss of Hampshire triggered wild speculation that lasted for decades afterwards. Was it a mine that actually sank her, or was it a bomb planted by German or IRA saboteurs, or even by the British? Did Kitchener in fact survive? Was the ship carrying a fortune in gold? Books have been written about the sinking. The wreck of Hampshire is today, however, a very sensitive war grave, and as a consequence, all diving on it is prohibited. However, in 2016, to mark the 100th anniversary of the sinking, I was granted a special diving licence by the UK Secretary of State for Defence to lead a team of 12 experienced deep wreck technical divers, each a specialist in a particular underwater field, on a 2-week expedition to survey the wreck, to photograph it, to video it, and to bring the latest 3D photogrammetry techniques to digitally record the wreck for posterity. Although 3D photogrammetry is fairly common now on shipwrecks, back then it was very new, a specialist field, and as far as I know, this was the first time it had been used to image a deep shipwreck. Because I am one of the 10 patrons of the GB in Ireland chapter of the Explorers Club of New York, because this expedition was considered to be of historic importance, the expedition was awarded one of the 200 Explorers Club flags to carry with us on the expedition. These flags have a life of their own, and each goes on several expeditions a year. Explorers Club flags have been to the South Pole with Amundsen, to the North Pole with Captain Peary, went with Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing to the top of Everest in 1953, been to the deepest part of the ocean, and went with Buzz and Neil to the moon in 1969. But the particular flag that we had been awarded for this expedition had started off life in 1968 on an expedition to Alaska. It had been to the Himalayas, Mount Ararat, a number of other expeditions, including going across the Atlantic twice in hot air balloons before it was lost on expedition in 1977. The flag was only refound in about 2015, and then it was awarded to my expedition in 2016 to take to the Hampshire. Finally, after 2 years of planning and preparation, the 12 divers of the dive team arrived in Scapa Flow about 1 week before the 100th anniversary. All our gases were mixed, all our kit was prepared, and we were off in the beautiful Scapa Flow dive vessel Huskian, leaving Scapa Flow and passing to the west through Hoy Sound before travelling up the west coast of the Orkney mainland, following the route taken by the Hampshire. But although we were passing over a slow rolling gentle swell, as we got our kit ready on deck for the first dive, our minds all turned to what it must have been like for the Hampshire going the same path but in a 30-foot tall swell. Moving further up the west coast of Orkney, in the distance the towering cliffs of Marwick Head start to rise up from the sea. The Hampshire lies 1.5 miles out to the west of those cliffs. This is us arriving above the site of the Hampshire. In the distance you can see the Kitchener Memorial on the top of the 200-foot high cliffs. This is the dive deck of the Huskian dive vessel. We're all diving rebreathers, that was my unit. Here's my dive buddy Paul Haynes just sorting out the decompression trapeze, so it's ready to deploy for us to decompress on the end of the dive. All of us were diving rebreathers, and we made sure that we were all diving the same diluent or bottom gas, just to standardise everyone's run times and gas usage. Each rebreather diver carried 2 open circuit bailout cylinders, a deep bailout cylinder under your left arm and an oxygen-rich decompression bailout system under your right arm, so that we can do the whole dive on open circuit on these cylinders if the rebreather on your back fails. And to make sure there were no mix-ups, we all carried the same mixes of deep bailout and shallow decompression bailout. This is just a short bit of video showing you what it's actually like to dive off the Husky. So I'm just holding my GoPro and its underwater housing here in my hands. And you move towards the dive gate, the opening through the side of the boat, and you just wait there until the skipper comes up, slightly up current of the Dan buoy, from which a line goes all the way down to the heavy shot on the seabed beside the wreck. So on the skipper's command, you jump into the water, there's an explosion of bubbles, and then you surface and you give the boat a OK signal to show that you're OK. And now I'm just going to bob on the surface here in very clear water, waiting for my dive buddy Paul to come into the water. You can see Paul giving me an OK signal and an OK signal to the skipper on the boat, and then we fin over to the buoy and then follow the line down to the shipwreck, which is about 230 feet beneath us. This is an artist's illustration I got made of the wreck on the seabed. Ship is upside down and it's bow to the right, stern to the left. The most obvious thing is that the keel of the ship has gone from basically the bow, the stem, all the way back to the 2 7.5-inch gun turrets P and Q. Now part of that would have been the mine explosion, but also part of it, I believe, has been grabbed out by salvors looking to get access to where the alleged gold was stored on the ship. The 3 anchor capstan shafts project upwards. They would have connected into the anchor capstan motors, which have now fallen into the debris of the ship. Just slightly to the left of the 3 anchor capstan axles, you can see the ammunition hoist trunking for the 7.5-inch main battery A turret, which was situated just in front of the bridge superstructure. Slightly to the left of that is the starboard inboard torpedo tube, and then there's a curved brass bulkhead. This brass bulkhead is concave, it's been blast damaged, and it's situated just in front of the lower auxiliary control room. From this bow damage aft, the keel of the ship, which is relatively flat, is in pretty decent shape, although a large fissure is opening up along the port side between the armour belt and the keel, and this is now exposing the boilers and the engines. The ship actually capsized to starboard on the surface, and as it turned upside down, everything that wasn't secured to the ship fell to the seabed, and this all litters the seabed in a debris field to the east of the ship, which is at the left hand side of the image here. And you've got 6-inch secondary guns, you've got yarrow boilers for the pinnaces, you've got the main mast and bits of rigging lying out there. Finally, at the very stern, you've got the 2-storey 6-inch double casemate. You've got the Y, or aftmost 7.5-inch main battery turret under the ship, and then you've got the port side propeller is still in place. The starboard propeller was lifted illegally to the surface in 1983. And finally, the fantail of the ship has the name of the ship, Hampshire, missing the H, still ringing around it in brass letters. This is the descent on day 1 from the surface. Out here in the Atlantic, you get extremely clear water. You can see the downline there at left of shot, and we had visibility every day of more than 50 metres. And the ship just now is, 30 metres still beneath me. I'm just heading down the line. So this is on the seabed at 65 metres or something like that. I'm just shooting the wreck in ambient light on my GoPro. Again, you can see how clear it is. So we're moving forward from the very stern, just along the port side of the ship. So I'm actually above the underside of the main or weather deck here. So the ship has been obviously higher up at some point, and it's just sagged over to the left of shot as the thing's collapsed. The port propeller is about 43 tons, still on the wreck, absolutely magnificent sight. The starboard propeller was lifted illegally in 1983, sat in the harbour and peeped ahead for many years while I was working there, before being returned to Hoy, where it's now on display outside the Naval Museum. So I'm just moving forward along the port side. There's the free section of tail shaft for the port prop running towards its hull tube. And over at the left you can see the ammunition hoist cylinder for the Y turret, the aftmost 7.5 inch main battery gun. And it's actually now holding up the keel bar. The 7.5 inch shells and propellant charges would have been housed in magazines and shell rooms at the bottom of this cylindrical armoured housing, and would have been passed up from the shell rooms on hoists through this cylinder to the gun house for Y turret. So just moving further forward, this is the back of Y turret, the aftmost main battery gun. So we can see that the single 7.5 inch barrel isn't swung out to port, and it's not pointing directly astern, so it looks to me that the barrel is swung out to starboard. And you can see right through to the other side of the ship here to see free water underneath the overhanging ship. So just continuing to move further forward, that's the underside again of the main deck. And off to the right of shot you can start to see the main mast, which is just lying flat in the seabed. And here's the 2-storey double casemate, and on the seabed you can see the 6-inch barrel for what would have been the topmost of the two weapons. The lower weapon was removed after Jutland because it was found to be pretty hopeless, it was so close to the water, and that firing port was plated over, and today you can see how the plate is just rusted through in the middle, and the gun is no longer there. So just looking at some shackling for the main mast here. The seabed is hard shale, there's no sand, it's all swept away. These triangular things are just supports for one of the searchlight platforms higher up the mast. This archive photograph of a double-storey casemate on another vessel shows you what it was like, and if I flip the image upside down it gives you an idea of what we're looking at on the seabed. So moving further forward up the port side of the ship, you can see there's a number of portholes lying on the seabed in sections of the original plating. Now these were all in place in the late 90s when I dived the Hampshire last, but today the weight of the portholes has just pulled the rotted steel plating from the ship, leaving this great big gap about a deck high, which would have been the unarmoured part of the shell plating above the actual armour belt. So the armour belt is still in position, and this gap is where there was the unarmoured deck with all these portholes in it. So continue to move further forward past all these sections of plate with portholes in them, and out in the seabed in the debris field there's this thing sticking upright. Now the first time I saw this in the late 90s I didn't know what it was, but it's actually one of the 6-inch guns that was mounted on the deck when the ship was afloat, and as the ship capsized this gun has fallen free from its mount and fallen through the water column essentially like a dart, and then plunged straight into the hard seabed for about, I don't know, 15 feet, 20 feet, and it's remained upright, impaled in the seabed since 1916. So swimming away from the impaled gun and moving back towards the wreck, we're now looking at some of the sections of the 6-inch armour belt. So as the ship has sagged and collapsed, some of these plates have come apart. And this is the thickest part of the armour belt, at 6 inches thick. So just down at the bottom of the shot, you can see upturned toilets. So we're now in the vicinity of the heads. So continuing to move further forward, we're now in the vicinity of the collapsed bridge superstructure. You can see the thickness of the armour belt and how the plates have come apart, but you can also see the rows of circular holes for rivets. So the rivets have all disappeared through differential corrosion. And you just get this perforated look, which is very common on shipwrecks. So this is just all the bridge superstructure here. Collapsed the seabed and squashed. Continuing to move forward along the port side, you can see the perforations from where rivets have disappeared. Porthole, that would all be on the unarmoured deck above the armour belt, which you can just see at the top left of the screen. There's a cage lamp in the debris. And more portholes in the unarmoured shell plating. And we've now reached the part where the armour belt plates are disturbed. That's just as a result of the collapsing of the ship. So I'm just swimming up the side of the armour belt. And as I approach what would have been the keel of the ship, we've got the bridge area is off to left of shot and the bow is off to right of shot. And you can see already the cylindrical ammunition hoist for A turret would have taken the shells and propellant cartridges from the magazines up to A turret, which is buried underneath the bow here. And you can see the 3 axles of the capstan drive, so those circular parts would have connected into the capstan motors at the very bottom of the ship. And as the ship has collapsed down, essentially those capstan drives have been thrust up. But also you can see that they're not bent by any explosion, so we know that the mine explosion didn't happen in the vicinity of these capstan axles. Continuing to move along the port side, the forefoot, that's the very bottom of the stem or bow, now begins to appear in the distance with divers down at the seabed level in what we worked out was a large pit caused by the bow grounding as it was sinking, and then as it capsized it scoured out this big pit in the seabed. And the keel bar has been severed and it's now bent off and it's hanging over the starboard side of the ship at left of shot. So we're still at the very bottom of the tapered section of armour belt. It's very thin here, it's only about 2 inches thick and is very different from the all or nothing armour that the Americans adopted with the classes of dreadnoughts that came after USS Nevada, where the whole bow section forward of the citadel is unarmoured in the hope that shells would just pass right through. But here we are at the very bow of the ship. The seabed all around is a hard shale, just covered in lots of small rocks and boulders. There's no silt at all because the currents are so strong out here in the Atlantic that any silt is swept away. And that's just looking back along the keel from the very bow towards the bridge. Swimming aft from the forefoot at the very base of the bow, we very quickly come to this huge area between where the bridge would have been and just short of the bow. So in this artist's illustration that got made up, you can see where we are at the very tip of the bow over to right of shot. We're swimming aft over this large open area where all the keel frames, all the longitudinal stringers, all the shell plating, it's all gone. And you can see the three axles of the capstans, you can see the ammunition hoist, and you can see the famous curved brass bulkhead. You can also see the corrugated beam torpedo tube that would have been on the starboard side, just lying there in the debris. So this is looking in from the port side into that open area. There's the curved brass bulkhead, more of that later. You can see the ammunition hoist trunking, the cylinder off at right of shot, and just forward in the middle of the image you can see the corrugated torpedo tube from the starboard side. So the brass bulkhead that you can see at left of shot, just underneath the keel, was interesting because it's concave from the effects of a large explosion such as a mine between the brass bulkhead and the ammunition hoist trunking. So we actually located the brass bulkhead on the ship's plans. So here we are looking down on the auxiliary control room from above, and you can see the ship's compass there with the brass bulkhead marked at right of shot. So this auxiliary control room was at the very bottom of the ship, directly underneath the navigation bridge or command bridge, higher up in the superstructure, and it was reached by a conning tower that went from the bridge all the way down to this lower conning tower. So you can see the ship's compass at right of shot with the brass bulkhead, the thick brown line marked on the plans. Either side of the compass are the helm and engine order telegraphs. And this bulkhead directly in front of the compass was brass because it's non-magnetic and wouldn't throw off the ship's compass. So I've just turned around from the brass bulkhead, which is now behind my back. I'm looking up the starboard side of the ship. There's the armour plate and the large bolts. And I'm looking at the cylindrical ammunition hoist trunking, which is damaged on the after side of the trunking. And also I thought when I was there it was slightly concave. So this kind of places the explosion between the curved or concave brass bulkhead and this ammunition hoist trunking. You can see the capstan axles or drive shafts just there at left of shot. And there's the armour belt plating on the port side that we rose up slightly earlier in this video. And here we've got the three capstan drive shafts or axles, which are unbent, so that indicates to me that the explosion wasn't up around here, and it's still placing the explosion between that brass bulkhead directly underneath the bridge and the A-turret ammunition hoist trunking, which is just there at left of shot. Most warships of this era had submerged torpedo tubes that fired out to either side. Sometimes they fired ahead from just under the bow and some fired from astern. But for the torpedo tubes that were on the beam, they couldn't just fire a torpedo tube straight out into water when the ship might be moving at 21 knots because the torpedo would just jam. So the torpedo would be in this ram, which was mechanically projected out from the side of the ship into the moving water that was flowing down the side of the ship. So the torpedo would be wholly outside the ship before it was fired. So there's the starboard torpedo tube, and that ram that we're speaking about would be inside that corrugated portion, and it would be mechanically projected straight out through the flat section, which would be just at the side of the ship. Here, just to right of shot, you can see the large bolts which go through the side of the ship, the shell plating through 2 inches of teak and then tap directly into the back of the armour belt plates, which are 6 inches thick in this area. And that's just one armour plate which has slipped and fallen to the seabed on the starboard side. And there's the actual side of the ship which would have been shrouding the torpedo tube itself. And that's the opening outer door of the torpedo tube, or muzzle, which would be open to allow the ram to extend into the water column. This is the seabed on the starboard side, and you can see in the diver's torch there's a torpedo body which seems to have been lifted out of the ship and placed there at some point in the past, presumably by salvors. Just underneath that section of armour plate that has just fallen to the seabed. And that's just looking up the starboard side towards the damaged ammunition hoist and axles. And at left of shot you can see the very thick heavy keel bar, which has just got about 30 foot of it left, and its end is resting on the seabed to starboard. So that would have taken some explosion to sever that keel. It's the keel bar is the strongest part of the ship. So moving up the starboard side towards the bow, you can see the severed keel bar off at left of shot, and you can see the thickish armour plate just beneath me here. So continuing to move up towards the bow on the starboard side, can you see how the seabed of shale seems to bank up, seems to rise up? It's almost as though the bow of the ship is in this great big pit, which I mentioned earlier we think was caused by the bow of the ship being on the seabed whilst the stern was still projecting above the water, and as it capsized to starboard it actually scoured this pit in the shale of the seabed. So beginning to move aft from the bow on the starboard side, passing the 3 capstan axles, a turret ammunition hoist trunking. You can see the armour belt plates with the 2 inches of teak in the thin steel of the inner shell of the ship, all secured by these huge bolts. There's the starboard inner torpedo tube, and that looks like a depth charge, or a dropping mine it was called in World War I, just in the debris there. And we're starting to see a jumble of these rectangular corrugated brass or tin boxes. So these are flash-proof containers that held the propellant charges for the 6-inch and 7.5-inch weapons. You can see there's a number of them underneath the plating of the keel. So the plating of the keel itself is fairly intact, except that all the rivets have gone and the keel is collapsing down. So we've got the armour belt plates on the right hand side of shot here. Same with the other side. The armour belt is obviously strong, it's staying structurally intact, and the keel is just collapsing downwards. So I'm just going to move over to the port side, at the other side of the ship from here, and follow the port bilge keel aft. So these bilge keels are just thin strips of steel that ran along the ship either side for a considerable portion of the midsection of the ship, and they're just designed to give the flat bottom of the ship a cutting edge for manoeuvring, and also to stop excessive rolling of the ship. So looking again at the artist's illustration, You can see how the armour belt on the port side is pretty much upright. You can see the flat keel of the ship, and between the two you've got this fissure opening up, which gets larger as you move aft and allows views down into the boiler rooms and the engine rooms. This is back to some footage moving towards the stern of the ship. That's the bilge keel directly under me, just in the middle of shot. You can see how the fissure is now opening up quite fully, allowing views down into the boiler room and engine room. Now, we didn't go down inside the ship at all on this expedition because it's a very sensitive war grave, and the terms of our licence prevented any entry into the ship. So we're just swimming above the ship here, looking down. And you can see the boilers off to right of shot. And that's the underside of the decking just at left of shot. So those are Scotch marine boilers, the circular ones there on the right of shot. So continuing to move aft towards the stern of the ship. The side of the ship reforms here. And approaching the stern of the ship in the vicinity of where the port prop shaft comes out of the hull tube, we see here a shell room. All these shells are still neatly stacked, and these are 6-inch shells and would have been for the double-story 6-inch casemate that we saw at the very beginning of this video. But it's particularly interesting that these shells are all just still there in position in the shell room. Here's the free section of shaft coming out of the hull tube. So the shaft leads directly to the port prop shaft, which is still on the wreck. The starboard prop shaft was illegally removed in 1983 and is now to be found at the Lyoness Naval Museum on the island of Hoy. Now, at the very stern of the ship, on the seabed, there's a real jumble of stuff. There's 6-inch containers for propellant charges. You can see the cordite sticks like spaghetti sticking out of the charges. They would have been wrapped up in leather containers inside. The leather is rotted away, and the spaghetti-like cordite sticks are now free and projecting out of the flashproof containers or lying around on the seabed. Now we're just starting to move forward on the seabed along the port side of the ship. So the ship had 9 Hotchkiss or Vickers 3-pounder rapid-fire guns on either beam of the ship, designed to target enemy torpedo boats that might try and approach for a torpedo shot. So these 3-pounder guns are still all there. They're all upside down. That's actually the base turning mechanism for a 3-pounder, where the actual barrel is beneath the seabed. It's just buried in the seabed. You can see all the steam and coal lying around. So we're looking to see how many of these 3-pounder guns we can spot. There's a porthole just underneath. Another porthole embedded in a section of ship's shell plating. Section of a cordite tin, another porthole still in the shell plating. So it's the weight of these portholes has just ripped the corroded thin shell plating from the ship away from the hull itself. It's just fallen flat to the seabed. So that's the opening part, or the inside part of the porthole. So that's the inside of the shell plating that would have been above the armour belt when the ship was the right way up. You can see there's a huge big long row. There's one of the 6-inch guns that was deck mounted. It's now buried beneath the ship. 2 of the others are fallen and poleaxed into the seabed. There's another 3-pounder gun upside down. You can see the firing pistol for the gun. You can see the handle of the gun. And I'll just put up a couple of images of the actual 3-pounder weapon so you can just get a better idea of what it looked like in action. Now back at the very stern of the ship, there's a section of the fantail which lies flat on the seabed upside down. And when we swam round the back of that, it's just a little way away from the ship itself. It's actually got the name of the ship still embossed in it in large brass letters, but it's missing the HA, so it's Shire we've got left, not Hampshire. But even so, very poignant to look at that and see the identity of the ship so starkly demonstrated. S-H-I-R-E, Hampshire. And then just moving up the starboard side of the ship, that's the remainder of the prop shaft from where the prop itself that was illegally salvaged in 1983 was removed and taken to the surface. The salver said that it was lying on the seabed beside the wreck, and they didn't damage the wreck, they just picked up something that had fallen from the wreck. So here we are on the last dive of the 2-week trip. All of us safely back up on the deco trapeze for about 2 hours of decompression. And we've detached the deco trapeze from the main downline, and we're now just drifting free in the current at about 1.5 knots away from the ship. So Paul Haynes and myself, that's Paul on the right, me in the middle, we're members of the Explorers Club of New York, and this is the Explorers Club flag that we took down the last day and tied off on the deco trapeze as we drifted away for the final long decompression hang of the trip. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like or subscribe to my channel. Fair winds and following seas.